Thank you. My name's Anna McCord. I'm a research fellow in the social protection team with Rachel at ODI. And the first thing I'd like to say is that this, I'm surprised they haven't said it themselves, this really is an excellent volume. It's accessible, it's very practical, and it really explains some of the key concepts and debates in social protection in a very, very useful and informative way. And I think it really is an excellent resource. It's not an academic volume, but in terms of a reference resource, I think it's extremely useful and really fills quite a gap in the current market. Unfortunately, I don't get a cut from Edward Elgar, so I'm not saying these are for any self-seeking reasons, but I really think it's an excellent volume. And I think, moreover, it's based on the experience of 15 case studies explicitly, but it's also based on many, many decades of experience from the authors. And I think that some of the insights which come from this book are actually really quite critical in terms of the current social protection debate. And they actually have quite important implications for how we think about the selection of different social protection instruments. And even they challenge some of the popular approaches to social protection which are predominant today among donors and among implementing governments throughout Africa. So there's really some quite major issues in the book. And so I've just been given 10 minutes, and I thought what it would be useful to do is to highlight the real headline messages which to me come out of the book, the most important issues which come out of it. And then to look at some of the insights which Frank has mentioned in passing, but to try and perhaps draw out a little bit more on some of the key issues. And finally, to look at some issues which are omitted from the book, which perhaps it might also be useful to consider. And to me, there were three big headline issues, and they don't completely overlap with Frank's headlines, three key issues, which I think is interesting. Key message which came through repeatedly was that if you want to address vulnerability through a social protection intervention, short or medium-term programs are very unlikely to achieve that outcome. And I think that experience is really repeated throughout the book, throughout the case studies. And actually this really offers quite a fundamental challenge to the donor community, to the policy community, because it means that interventions offering one-off points of contact with the poor, for example, short-term public works employment, trade fairs, a transfer which just happens for a short period, actually is unlikely to have a significant impact on livelihoods or poverty reduction. And what you tend to see in these cases is a return to the status quo ante once the program finishes. And if we really take that to heart, that has got quite serious implications for the current social protection thinking. Another issue which came out was in the area of targeting, and I think this was really critical. Without saying it in so many words, the book says actually we shouldn't be worried about inclusion errors, including the wrong people in public work, in social protection programs. That shouldn't be our concern. The bigger issue is in fact exclusion errors. What we're seeing is that in terms of social protection provision, vast numbers of those who are in need, who perhaps might even be eligible, are excluded from participation because of problems with scale, problems with coverage. So perhaps we need to rethink the way that we think about the question of targeting and ask ourselves how we can address the exclusion challenge rather than be preoccupied with preventing the inclusion of inappropriate people. Perhaps that's actually the bigger question. And I think the third headline message is the fact that none of this is possible unless there are commitments to recurrent funding of social protection. And that holds true both from the donor community but also from governments implementing these programs. And I think perhaps the funding aspect is the least developed aspect of the book. And I think that the underlying message is that actually if you want to have the kind of successful programs that Frank was talking about, there has to be an ongoing budgetary commitment to them. And that also has quite significant implications. Just very briefly, Frank mentioned what he felt were the conditions for success, and I think that's also worth reiterating. He said that programs which were successful tended to be those which are national, underwritten by legislation, and permanent. And the reason that those are successful is because they conform to this predictable funding, predictable needs concern. They're consistent, they're coherent, they're of prolonged duration, and they have extensive coverage. Now, while that's true, if one actually looks around Africa, there are extremely few examples of social protection programs which actually conform to this ideal type. And in fact, there are three mentioned in the book, Ethiopia, PSNP, Kenya, and Ghana. But there are very few examples. Perhaps these three are the only major three currently going ahead in Sub-Saharan Africa. And there may be a few more, but this is very atypical. Most social protection programs don't have those characteristics which the team has identified as necessary for impact. Okay, very briefly, I just wanted to draw out what I thought were the critical insights in 5 of the areas which the book looks at: targeting, market effects, assets and graduation, cost effectiveness, and accountability. Now, these insights are implied in the book, but not actually drawn out, and I think they're worth giving more attention to. The first issue is targeting. And this question of targeting is very pertinent to the current debate. At the moment, there's quite a lot of space in the policy discourse given to this approach which says one very pragmatic way of dealing with targeting is to say, let's target a certain percentage of the population, because we can assume that X percentage of the population are poor. And this is quite viscerally attractive because it's an easy formula to apply. But the book mentions recent work carried out by Frank actually looking at what this might mean. And what you see is that actually, among the poorer households, perhaps the 6 bottom deciles in a community, there's often only marginal differences in the household income of those groups. So if you target the very poorest deciles, for one, you may be giving them an income which actually will significantly elevate them to a much more affluent status than those in the associated deciles. But also it's very inequitable because you are helping one group, whereas another group who are only marginally less poor, perhaps a difference of a few percentage points in terms of monthly income, are excluded from that benefit. So I think it's very, very important that this book challenges some of the rules of thumb which are being adopted for targeting in Sub-Saharan Africa social protection programs in that way. And this is illustrated very nicely in the book if you wanted more information on that. The next issue, market effects. That's discussed in the book. There's a question about the economic impact, the labour market impact of social protection programs. There's discussion about their potential inflationary effects, discussion of the possible economic stimulus effects, i.e. positive and negative market impacts which people are concerned may be associated with social protection interventions. But I think something which is mentioned in the book but doesn't come out so clearly is that any kind of market effect is contingent on the size of the intervention itself. Many social protection interventions, they're small scale, the value of the transfer is low, there's low coverage, and they're probably targeted at excluded and economically marginal or remote populations. So for all these reasons, it's quite likely that the market impact of a social protection intervention may be trivial. And this is quite important because if we're thinking about social protection as a potential vector for growth, at the moment during the financial crisis, we're hearing that social protection may be an instrument for delivering growth. But actually, it may be that link between social protection and growth is much more complex than many people would suggest. And also, given the nature of the people who are targeted in social protection programs, we can't assume that these market effects will apply. So I thought that was an interesting one to raise. Very briefly, there's also a prevailing idea that the transfer of assets is going to promote people's livelihoods, and an underlying assumption that social protection is likely to lead to graduation out of poverty, and that Rachel mentioned that in the introduction. It came up subsequently. Now, this notion of graduation really may not be realistic. Again, it depends on the value of the transfer, the period of the transfer, what beneficiaries can actually do with that transfer. So I think the book very importantly raises some questions about these assumptions to do with graduation. And in fact, the idea of graduation is associated with the idea that poverty is a problem. One can apply a response, make a transfer, and then it can be resolved, rather than seeing poverty as a process and a structural issue. And I think that's something that the book doesn't explicitly draw out, but it's implicit in the case studies. Okay, now I think I just have a minute or two left, so I wanted to raise 1 or 2 other issues. One is the book raises the problem of trying to assess the cost of social protection. And it's actually very difficult to look at what the cost of these transfer programs are. And it's particularly difficult to make any kind of comparisons, because it's very hard to know what costs are included in the budget of a social protection program and what are excluded. And to get consistent sets of data which are included in costings is highly problematic. So that gave me a slight problem with the book, because having acknowledged this problem in actually looking at the cost of social protection transfers, they then put a a matrix in which actually did exactly that and compared the costs of the programs. And in fact, this is really quite a problematic area. Now, there's not only a problem with cost. The other issue is that there's a huge problem with impact, which Frank referred to. And most of the evaluations look at, was the resource transferred as desired to the appropriate person? It doesn't actually look at the impact of that transfer of resources to the beneficiary. So actually, in terms of cost effectiveness, you've got a real problem. You're not quite sure what the costs are, and you're not quite sure what the impacts are. So this problem is alluded to in the book, but I think not fully developed. But the other interesting factor is that what emerges from the book is that there's very limited donor or government interest in actually looking at cost effectiveness. And cost effectiveness isn't the basis for program selection in many instances. And a particular problem is that there isn't a focus on studying the impact of programs over time. Evaluation assessments tend to cease at the point at which the cash transfer, or whatever the nature of the transfer is, terminates. They don't look at the impact 6 months down the line, 12 months down the line, to actually see what the livelihood impact is. So there's a real problem in both costs and impact assessment of social protection programs. And what this leads us to is a huge accountability problem. And again, this is alluded to in the book, but I think not drawn out as a particular, as a specific issue. There's very little downward accountability to the beneficiaries, and very little upward accountability to us as taxpayers in developed countries, or even taxpayers in developing countries. So you can see around accountability, around cost effectiveness, there are a lot of unanswered questions that the book alludes to, but perhaps doesn't go into in detail. And this question of cost effectiveness actually is becoming increasingly important because in the context of constrained donor budgets, constrained national developing country budgets with a massive reduction in inflows from commodities due to the reduction in commodity prices, government budgets are being squeezed. So it's really important that we can say things about cost effectiveness. Otherwise, how can one choose between different kinds of social protection programs? Okay, reading between the lines, other things that aren't actually said in the book but are hinted at. It seems that there's quite poor donor coordination at country level. It seems that there's quite inefficient use of the total funding envelope, i.e. there are all kinds of inefficiencies and inconsistencies which are likely to undermine the impact of social protection expenditure at national level. And there seems to be a problem that program design may not be consistent with actually having a sustained impact on poverty, particularly in programs which only have a medium-term time frame themselves. And finally, there were a few issues which were omitted from the book, and I think deliberately, but I wanted to bring them to the table for discussion today. And one is this question of accountability. I mean, that really is critical. What kind of feedback loops are in place in social protection programs? What opportunities for voice are there for beneficiaries? And this really is a thorny area. And in other parts of the development discourse, this issue of accountability has been highlighted, but with regard to social protection, it hasn't really been very prominent. The next major issue, which I think is a problematic omission, is the question of the risk and liability implication of large-scale programs. And here what I mean is the kind of program which was recommended by Frank and the team as the kind of program likely to have an impact is one which is sustained, guaranteed, legislated. But what that actually means is considerable recurrent costs on the part of government implementing them. And that's quite problematic in the context of, for example, volatile commodity prices. So actually it's asking a lot of a government to make a commitment to these kind of recurrent costs under social protection when their own revenue perhaps fluctuates. And that's a very important question to start thinking about. And that then relates to donor responses in terms of actually donors making commitments, medium to long-term commitments of funds. So affordability is a major constraint to actually implementing the kind of ideal programs that the team identified. And finally, there are major trade-offs and policy choices. You've got fiscal contraction at national level. You've got challenges to commitments to development spending among donor governments. And clearly there are going to be major trade-offs and policy choices having to happen among donors and developing country governments. And at the moment, it seems that perhaps efficiencies in the social protection sector are quite poor, and there's a lot more work to be done to look at how funds can most effectively be spent in order to address poverty through social protection. Thank you.
Okay, thanks very much. Okay.